Technology goes through these interesting phases, and we're kind of in one I'm not enjoying as much at the moment. And specifically, I'm talking about consumer technology, consumer hardware and devices. This will be kind of a two-part bit here, talking about these subjects. I've split it up into two different little takes, but basically, whether it's gaming devices or entertainment in general, or like communication devices such as your smartphone or cell phones, these things always start out as kind of large, unwieldy, and not very efficient because we're using technology that happens to exist at the time, components and hardware that exist at the time, to fit a new role, a new niche, right? So when you look back at the original cell phones, they were behemoths. Well, first of all, your original mobile phones were attached to a car or a suitcase, or eventually when they became quote unquote portable as a handheld device, they were like a gigantic brick, right? Because we had technology and components that were for other things, that we were saying, what if we could just carry this with us wherever we go? And so we had to accommodate that with the pre-existing stuff. So it was kind of unwieldy. It was not optimized for the function. Over time, it became optimized for the function. Your cell phone slowly but surely shrank, and you had things like pagers and beepers, of course, as well, was an option. That was a whole other field. Kind of cool as well. But the cell phone shrank and became something that was like a small bar or small block or whatever that fit in your pocket, and eventually became slimmed down flip phones and just really small devices. Just a little keypad, a little screen, and everything became more and more and more miniaturized. The antennas required, the processors required, the speakers and microphones, everything that went into, and the LCD technology, everything that went into making a cell phone got smaller and more efficient and easier to produce and just overall better for the function. Therefore, the devices shrunk and became slimmer and easier to carry around with us. They were not bulky and unwieldy and obnoxious anymore. And they became more and more and more feature-rich. They became focused around playing games on them and sending text messages and pictures. They even had cameras in them. And then you had where they were like colorized and better screens, all these things, right? That was kind of like the golden age of pocketable devices, because this was the same thing with, for instance, gaming. Game Boys were the same way. You had the Game Boy back in the 80s that launched, and it was kind of a brick. Even now, I like it. It's cool. But down the road, you got the Game Boy Pocket, which was a slightly slimmed down version of that. Then you got the Game Boy Color, which is still my favorite piece of portable gaming hardware, where you had better sound, better screen, slimmer, fewer batteries used, and of course, more color. Then you had the Game Boy Advance, which was just another step above the Color. Still very pocketable. In fact, they slimmed it down even further when they made the clamshell design, which was backlit for the first time. Well, wait, there was a Game Boy. There was a Game Boy in the 90s that was lit too, but it was like a pocket version. But anyways, then you had the Game Boy Micro, which was like the last of the line and wasn't really all that big a deal because you already had the DS coming out. But see, that's where it starts to kind of change. You went from devices that had their own games developed for them to match the hardware and gave a different experience. And so you had these smaller things, but then everybody wants more. So you started getting the DS, which is a larger device with double screens. You started getting smartphones, which everybody wanted to access the internet and do all these other things on the go. So you started getting bigger screens, you started getting keyboards attached to it, and then eventually you got touchscreen devices. And now we're to a point where all these devices have now grown, and they're becoming obnoxious and unwieldy again. Even your high-end smartphones these days, where everybody talks about how slim they are and all this stuff, yeah, but they're huge. You can barely use these things with a single hand. And that was like one of the beauties of like at least the early on smartphones. They were palmable. They fit into your hand and could be used while doing other tasks, or at the very least, not have to use both hands to like reach a notification at the top of your screen and do something down here and type. And I don't know, it's like we've gone backwards. We've gone from everything was shrinking and becoming easier to use, more intuitive and more portable, to now everything's kind of blowing back up to being more obnoxious, unwieldy, and where you need a backpack to carry it around. So to continue on with that subject, on the next point I'd like to make, I already kind of hinted at it, and that was talking about the transition from Game Boys, like the Game Boy Advance, to the DS devices. And the fact that, and this is very similar to smartphones and various other media devices as well, we once built these things for a purpose, and that was to accompany us on the go, right? A Game Boy, Game Boy Advance, Game Boy Color, whatever, whichever one it was built to be a portable gaming device. It was not built to be a portable Super Nintendo or a portable N64 or later a portable GameCube. They were complementary devices. At home, you played your GameCube. You played your Nintendo 64, etc. If you were going somewhere, you were like, oh, you know what? I'm gonna be riding on the bus. I'm gonna be riding in the car. I'm going to be sitting somewhere for a bit, waiting for someone, whatever it was. You took your Game Boy with you and played Pokemon, or played the Game Boy version, which was different, but you played the Game Boy version of Super Mario, or you played some other, a Mega Man game, or some other random licensed property, whatever it is, right? There's tons of thousands of games for Game Boy, the Game Boy family, right? But they were specifically built for that hardware to be their own experience, and it was on the go. You got that cool little platformer, you got that puzzle game, Tetris or whatever, you got, an RPG, which something like Pokemon or Final Fantasy on the Game Boy, was more akin to like what something might be on the NES, but it wasn't built to be an NES emulator. It was just these games were built for Game Boy. And then you went home, and when you turned on your GameCube or whatever, you had a whole other set of games available to you. So it was thought of as a different experience. It was thought of as a complementary experience. It was something that you kind of just did that on the go if you wanted, or when you were laying in bed or chilling on the couch while somebody else watched the news or whatever it was, right? Kind of similar with smartphones. Smartphones and cell phones in general were purpose-built to be a communication device, for me to be able to call you, to text you, whatever, and then eventually grew to, well, on the go, there's these things I want to be able to check email or play like a casual game or do a video call. These things, they grew and expanded. And what the problem is, instead of these devices being a complementary part of our life, like as of our lifestyle, to add to our lifestyle, to make more options available to us, in many ways they have become our lifestyle. We work to pay these exorbitant mobile phone device fees to consume the majority of our media, the majority of our social interactions, the majority of our, even sometimes gaming and things like that, or just entertainment in general, through the device, right? It's no longer a tool for your lifestyle. In so many ways, the device has become the lifestyle, and therefore the device has to have a huge screen to accommodate everything you're trying to do. It has to have all this processing power to accommodate it, and all these features and abilities. So your device went from being something that was very portable, fit in your hand. Oftentimes they were tougher too. They were built out of cheaper materials oftentimes, but it was stuff that wasn't as delicate. But same thing with gaming. You no longer have like a portable version of gaming and then the home version of gaming, whether it's PC or console or whatever. The devices now are built to be mobile versions of your PC or your console, like say the Nintendo Switch or the Steam Deck or Asus ROG Ally or whatever it is. it's no longer a separate experience from what you have there. It's an on-the-go experience, and therefore these things are huge. Like, there's really good pictures out there that are a comparison of like a PSP, for instance, compared to a Steam Deck or even a Nintendo Switch. And I'm sorry, the difference is drastic. And it's actually kind of disappointing when you look at the PSP, which in a lot of ways could be seen as like the peak of like portable 3D gaming and such. And then it had other features. You could watch video, browse the internet, there was apps, you could put music on it, all that kind of stuff. But it was small. It had a good sized screen, had good controls, and it fit in your pocket though. It was easy, right? Now everything is like 18 inches across, and even your phone is like 8 inches, 7 inches with a stylus to use it now. So I just think we have this creep when it comes to the size of our devices and how obnoxious and unwieldy they've become, because they are now like the actual lifestyle we are living instead of something that we enjoy alongside of it. So Captain America Brave New World debuted this weekend over the Valentine's Day weekend, which, number one, I thought that was strange, but I'll go into that in a minute. I saw the headline for the box office total, and I immediately knew something was kind of up when it said 192 million globally. Now, this is a valid number, obviously. I'm a huge fan. I've always been a box office watcher. So when I say I'm a huge fan, I mean of like following the movie box office and performance of films. And I've put over the last 20 years or so, a lot of study into the marketing and how these things work and budgeting and just in general what these numbers mean for movies and what different markets mean. Just anything having to do with box office movie tracking, it's something that I've paid a lot of attention to. Most of the things that I will talk about are kind of like that. I don't like to talk about things if I don't know anything about it. I could see that number coming out for many other films. A lot of standalone films, films that are not as big a property as Marvel is, right? So to see their big, I guess you'd call it tentpole movie, using the banner of Captain America and also starring Harrison Ford as Red Hulk, which, by the way, that aspect looks really cool. But when they say 192 million globally, you're like, oh, dang, that's a lot. And then you go, wait a minute. I've heard that kind of number for like domestic box office openings. So you go and you look at it, especially when it comes to Marvel. You go and you look at it, and sure enough, 92.4, which was the tail end of that number, 92.4 million was the overseas box office from like 52 other markets or something like that. Which means that over the holiday weekend of Valentine's that they decided to launch it on, it made about 100 million. Which, again, that's not a bad number. That's a very respectable number. And I believe this movie was on about a $200 million budget. And then you, of course, got approximately 50% of that is usually spent on marketing as well. So you're in the 300 million range in total that it has to make to make a profit. So again, with international box office, this movie should be profitable and make money. It's Marvel. It has that kind of ability. But it's Marvel. It's part of the MCU. It's under the Captain America banner, right? And it made $100 million on its opening weekend. That's not that big for what we're talking about here. Regardless of the budget size, you're used to seeing MCU films that are $100 million easy, breaking that number. And it's really strange to me that they chose this weekend. Valentine's Day weekend is usually like some sort of romantic comedies and then like some sort of slasher flick. Some sort of horror film usually comes out around Valentine's. So it's kind of odd timing in general. It's like they didn't want to try and put this movie up against the big summer tentpoles. Again, that's strange because it's Marvel. So I think we're starting to see some of that Marvel fatigue that's slowly but surely creeping in, right? They're always going to be big hit movies. They're always going to make money. But again, you're talking about a movie that has made $200 million globally and opened basically by itself over Valentine's weekend with no competition in sight. So, I don't know. I think that when you try and do this like kind of recasting and moving on thing with Marvel. Not recasting, but the moving on with the new characters and cast. It's not going to be as good as anybody wants it to be. And that Marvel fatigue, I think, that's definitely been starting to show over the last couple of years. The interesting thing about that is I work in, if you follow my channel or anything, I work in service. And over the years, I have been able to see the hype for films and cultural phenomenon from my guests, because oftentimes those two things are like very much tied together. Are people going out to eat and enjoying themselves and having a good time because they're going to see a movie, or they just got out of a movie, or what's going on, right? So in previous years, when there was like the what do you call it, the Barbenheimer phenomenon, that was obvious and everywhere. Literally just people dressed up in pink. But then you would always have conversations that you'd overhear or get to take part in about, the latest hit movies, whether that's Mission Impossible or Oppenheimer or even other Marvel films. Like, there was something there. A few years ago, I experienced this thing with Spider-Man, whatever the last Spider-Man movie was, where it supposedly made a bunch of money at the box office. And I was like, I don't know anybody who has even seen this movie or knew it was even out. And I completely forgot that Captain America Brave New World was even coming. And I think that the majority of people did. So I guess that would account for that 100 million over the weekend. Like I said, that's a respectable number. But is it really that respectable when you're talking about Marvel and a Valentine's weekend where there's no other competition it's facing? I don't know. I think we are seeing that fatigue.